welcome. So today we have a snow day. We're stuck indoors, and what I love to do whenever I'm stuck indoors is bake or cook something exciting that I usually don't have an opportunity to. And so today we're going to be baking some bread. I'm going to be making one loaf that we're going to use the traditional loaf pan for, and another one that we're going to freeform, like kind of like a French bread or a Italian bread loaf. But you can use whatever you want. If you want to make two loaf pans or two freeforms, you can even make like a French buell or something, but this is going to be a traditional white bread type of recipe. So I have all my ingredients and things I need and the tools laid out. So I have a medium to large size kitchen bowl for mixing. I have my bread loaf pan. I have a couple of pieces of pre-cut parchment paper, which I'll show you what we're going to do with them later. I have my flour. I love King Arthur all-purpose flour. I think it's one of the best. I've been baking bread with my grandfather since I was a child, and we've always used King Arthur flour. It's unbleached, just regular, don't get the bread flour. This really makes a really good white bread loaf. I'm also using dry yeast, the Soothe brand. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but it's an instant yeast I really love. You can also get the pre-measured packets at any grocery store, but you want to make sure that your yeast is fresh. And this is how it comes. You can see if you get a larger variety like the Soothe instant brand that comes in a bigger packet, you can always freeze it and then just make sure you take it out to get to room temperature before on the day you're going to be baking. So those are all the ingredients. So I like to lay out all my other ingredients besides the flour and the yeast. We have a good oil. You can use olive oil, or you can use like another type of organic oil. I like sunflower oil to add. I have a spray olive oil. This is just what I use to coat the loaf pan. So if you're using a pan, it's good to have an olive oil or other oil just to grease the pan. We're going to use salt. I like Morton's natural sea salt. You can also use another fine salt. You don't want to use a salt that's too clumpy, like a Himalayan sea salt. Even though I love it, it's just not great for bread baking. And then I have a nice honey brand, so just make sure it's a natural honey. Now the honey is what we're going to use to activate the yeast. So if you are a baker, you know that we need to activate the yeast. That is what gives it the rising capabilities for the bread. You could use sugar if you don't have honey, or if you're allergic or have some other issues with using honey. I just prefer it, but sugar also works. So whatever the measurements are for the honey, just replace it with sugar if that's something you like to do. For our tools, we have a, actually not sure what it's called technically, but it's like a bread sieve, flour sieve. This makes the flour really fine when you go through, and I'll show you how we do that when we're measuring it out. But this tool is something that I have been using again since I was a child, baking bread with my grandfather, and you can get these at any kitchen store or on Amazon if you prefer. Another tool, you want a liquid measuring cup, you want your dry measures all available, and then this is something that I love. This is to make sure, thermometer to make sure that the temperature of the water is the appropriate temperature to make sure our yeast can be activated. So I have this, I'm gonna get this started. This is a hot water boiler heater that you can use for tea or making kind of any type of hot beverage. But I have just water, regular tap water in there, and this one has a temperature. So you can it starts at 104 is the lowest, and then you can see what the temperature is. You can raise it up to boiling point. But we want our temperature to be between 110 but under 120, so it has to be pretty precise. So when the water heats up to the appropriate temperature, then we're going to pour it into our liquid measure and add our yeast. But then before we add the yeast, I'm gonna actually use this to make sure it's not too hot. We don't want it to be too hot where the yeast actually will die on us, and it needs to be warm enough where it's gonna actually grow when we add the honey to activate it. So while that is warming up to the appropriate temperature, I'm gonna start taking out our flour and measuring it out. So I just take our little handy sifter, and I have a 1 cup measuring cup, and we're gonna measure out 6 cups of flour. And I'm just gonna dump the flour into our little sieve. So about 1.5 to 2 cups at a time. So that's 2 cups right there. And now I just start sifting it. And you'll see when it comes through, it's a nice, fine, powdery flour into our bowl. And it basically gets all the clumps out and makes it nice and fluffy. It makes our flour really easy to work with when we're getting into our bread making. So that's 2 cups. I'm gonna add another cup. You can just place it in there so you can make sure that you get the right amount. This is 3 cups. I just like to use the side of the bag of the bread to make sure it's an even measure. So this is now 4. You can obviously double the recipe. If you want to make more than 2 loaves, you can double it. The bread really stays good if you wrap it properly and freeze it. You can take it out and use it over time, so you don't have to be spending all your snow days baking if you don't want to. All right, so 2 more cups, so 5.5 to 6 cups total of flour. I'm gonna do 6 cups today, just because I know what's needed for what I'm looking to do. You can always add a little bit more moisture down the line if you wanted to, if you needed, but 6 cups is a good measure for the 2 loaves. Now I'm gonna just set that aside. We're gonna need more flour later when we're ready to knead the dough. Sift all that. It's like snow outside. I don't know if you could see out the window, but it was snowing today. So now, as you see, we have this nice billowy pile of flour. I'm going to add our salt in a little bit. And then we're gonna have our dry mixture. And let me see, I think that this is ready. So we're going to take, I think about 2.5 cups. Let's try, but we'll start with just these. So this is a 1.5 cup measure. I might need to have a little bit more in the boil. And I want my yeast to have a nice cozy place. I'm just gonna get a second bowl. I'm gonna pour this 1.5 cups in. And then I'm just gonna fill up a little bit more water while I activate these. That's warming up. Let me add a little salt. I'm just going to get my teaspoon measure. So this is 1/2 teaspoon. 1. That's 1 teaspoon. You can obviously, I just grabbed the 1/2 one, but 2. And this is just a little bit over 2 teaspoons of salt. And I like to use my hands, so I'm just going to give it a good wash. You want clean hands when you're baking bread, and preferably no jewelry. So we should take this off and put it in a safe place. And with clean, dry hands, we're just going to mix this flour and the salt together. And then I take the flour and I just make a well with it. This is how I learned when I was growing up how to bake bread. You want to lift it all to the sides and just pat it down so you can make a nice well shape. And so this is to make room when we do add the yeast with the warm water. It's going to have a nice place to go in, and then we can start working our dough. All right, so this water's ready. So that was 1.5 cups. We're going to add another cup of water. Now this is where we're going to take our little temperature gauge. I'm just going to take it out of its shell, and if you can see, we can just see where it goes. We want to make sure, again, it's around 110 would be a good temperature. So we might have to, I think it should be good, but let's see. It might be a little, it's a cold day, so sometimes you need to make sure that it heats properly, and do it again so you get to the right temperature. This is a critical point. If you don't get your yeast water at the right temp, then the whole bread baking process is no bueno. All right, so it does need to be a little warmer, so I'm just going to reheat it. And again, take your time with it because, as I said, you want to make sure. Sometimes I even put it to boiling, but then keep an eye on it and then pull it sooner than later. And then let it go to like 130 because it's cooling down pretty quickly with the cooler weather outside. Let's try this again. Again, 2.5 cups water. Let's try this. See. See, right at 110 now. Perfect. All right, so this is where we can add our yeast. So we're going to take a tablespoon of our yeast and just add it to this water mixture. And I love yeast. I love the smell. I love when it hits the water, so I'll add a little bit more. I don't think there's any issue with adding a little bit more of the yeast. And then we're going to take our honey, and you want to add 2 tablespoons of a good honey, or this is where you can replace with 2 tablespoons of the sugar. And again, don't be stingy, even though I say 2. The yeast gets activated with the sugar, so you need that. we're just gonna let this sit for a couple of minutes. You'll know it's ready when it starts like bubbling. You see how the yeast comes and rises to the top and it's already starting to have these like almost clumps. That's good. That means it's actually getting activated properly. If it doesn't do that, like if it doesn't rise and it doesn't start having those like bubbles, that probably means your yeast is not good and you want to stop at that process and get a new yeast. So we're gonna let that sit just a little bit and let the honey, the sugars in the honey activate the yeast and get it all nice in there. All right, so we let the yeast settle and now we're just going to pour it gently into our little bowl of flour, all of it. And again, with clean hands, we're gonna start our mixing process. So it's nice and warm. I'm gonna slowly take the sides and just do a nice, gentle speed. So as you can see, I'm using my fingers. I'm just breaking up the flour and I'm slowly pulling it from the sides as I mix it together in the yeast, honey, water mixture. So not too much from the bottom yet. Again, you're just gonna pull from the sides. And as you're pulling, break it up with your fingers. It's very therapeutic for me, actually. I feel like baking is one of those things that is very calming. You really get into a zone, and getting your hands into dough and flour can be a very meditative, relaxing process, sort of like gardening, putting your hands in soil. It's one of those things that really just resonates with me. So again, just keep pulling from the sides as you go. And you'll see as you keep bringing in the flour, it starts to form a thicker mixture in the middle. So as I'm pulling it in, I'm breaking up the flour. You can see with my hands in each turn. I'm also squeezing a little bit, and this is to get any clumps out and to make sure it's a nice, smooth mixture as we're drawing in the flour. It's starting to thicken now. And just keep bringing in more, pulling it from the sides. And you can start drawing a little bit from the bottom too. Not too much because you don't want it to stick while it's still high in moisture. But as you go, you're going to end up getting all of that flour to form into a nice dough. So when my grandpa used to bake bread all the time growing up, when I was really little, he used to make 16 loaves at a time. So he had this huge stainless steel bowl that he used to use. And when he was doing this process, he used to do this battering thing with his hands just to bring all the flour in and make sure the ingredients were all incorporated. And it was just a big process because with 16 loaves at a time, it's a lot of dough. It's all coming together now. You can see it's starting to form thicker. And take your time with this. Again, it's, for me, I really find it a relaxing process. And once you draw in all the liquid, you'll see now it's starting to be the dough that that you want, and it's forming. So when it starts getting to this stage and you've gotten all the ingredients kind of incorporated in, you can transfer it to a flat, clean surface. So we've already cleaned off our surface area and make sure it's ready for the kneading process. And don't worry if all your flour didn't get sucked in. Like I said, on the drier days, you're gonna notice that the liquid, you might need a little bit more liquid, or you're gonna have some flour left over, and that's fine, because we can always use that when we transfer it to our flat surface. All right, so I'm just going to take this and just put it down on the table here. Just get all our dough together. And you see your hands get all kinds of grimy. That's why we take our jewelry off our hands beforehand. So I'm just gonna take this excess flour and I'm just gonna put it down on our surface, because that's gonna help us with kneading. And now you're gonna really press into the dough using your hands. I like to fold it over and then press. And you're gonna get more of that flour into your dough as you need it, because there's still moisture on the inside that can sop that up. And you want to knead for a good at least 5 to 10 minutes, I would say. So you can punch it down using your fists, really fold it over and incorporate what you have. We're working the dough, so it really helps to get everything incorporated and activate further what's necessary to get that dough to rise later and make a good bread. So don't skimp on this process. You see that it started off not so formed, but as you need more, you'll notice, see all that flour is getting picked up by the dough. So use your fists, get in there, turn it over. And then what I like to do is I just like to form it when I'm done with the initial kneading. I like to form it into this ball. So I'm just tucking in the loaves, you see. You can tuck it in so that it forms a ball. And I like to do it from the top. And then you can use the same bowl that you initially started with. I'm just going to dump out some of the excess flour because it's going to coat it then. Or you can take a clean bowl and put some olive oil in there so it doesn't stick. But either way, we're going to take it out and knead it again. So it doesn't really matter. I like to put it back in our little bowl that we started. And now, on a winter day, when it's a little colder out, I like to take a clean towel and cover it, and then I put it in the oven, which is the warmest place in the house, while it rises. So we will do that, and it's gonna rise covered in the warmest place that you can find for an hour, and we will see you back when we're ready to take it from there. We let our bread dough rise for about an hour covered, and so now it's nice and ready to punch down. It's grown in size, and we just want to pull it out of the bowl. It's gonna stick a little bit if you didn't grease it, but we're just gonna pull it all out and then put it on our surface. And you just want to punch it down. There's going to be some air bubbles and whatnot, so it's just time to get those out. And you spend a little bit to knead it. You'll hear some, you see there's some air bubbles. You want to punch those out and just knead it back and forth. Get it nice. Get any of that air out of the dough. Just for a few minutes. That was the first rise. We're gonna let it rise a second time, this time only for 30 minutes. Again, we're gonna cover it and put it in a warm place. But the kneading process needs to happen. Builds the gluten. Again, all those air pockets are kneading out. As if you can actually get your aggression out. Punch it if you want to. It's actually a technique. I'm not making this up. Make sure that your surface is floured, so you can keep that floured surface from earlier, or you can put some new flour down, and that's just to help it from not sticking to your surface. A little bit more. And bread making is fun because it's okay to make a little mess. It's also a good activity to do with your kids if they're interested. I know that whenever my son sees me baking bread, he always asks for a little ball of dough. So I kept it quiet this time, so he doesn't steal from my loaf. All right, so we needed our dough. I'm just gonna make it into a nice ball again. This time, just because it's gonna rise a little bit more, I'm gonna put some olive oil down so it doesn't stick to the bowl again. Get my towel. And we're going to cover this, and I'm just going to stick this inside our warm oven because it's a cold winter day. It's off, so don't put the oven on. You don't want to bake it yet. So 30 more minutes, we're going to set the timer, and we'll come back and we'll be ready to get it prepped for the oven and baking. Welcome back. So we let the dough rise again for 30 minutes covered, and it's just rose a little bit more after that. So now we're gonna prep our pans. So like I said, you can do 2 just freehand loaves, and you can use a baking sheet. I always add parchment paper so it doesn't stick and it's easy to cool once it's out of the oven. And then I'm gonna do 1 freeform and 1 loaf pan for this. So for the loaf pan, I also want to line it with parchment. You can also grease it really well, but what I find makes it really easy is if you dip the parchment in there. So I'm just going to cut this, and cut it to fit your pan. And I'm just going to put this in there like so. And it's going to stick out of the edges a little bit. And then I take my olive oil and then I just spray around the sides, so that just makes it extra easy to get out. So I'm going to set that aside. Now we're going to take our dough out again. And now we can, again, just knead it. We don't have to knead it as much this time because we've already gone through the process a couple times now, but we're just going to knead it down. Again, you hear those bubbles. You can see the air bubbles coming out as you need it. That's all the bubbles that formed as it rose for that last bit. So one more, this quick knead. I love popping those bubbles. And you can do this with the same recipe with other flour if you wanted to do like a wheat flour or add some other things like rye or whatnot. You can do a bunch of different things, but I, for today, wanted to do just more of a simple white bread recipe, which is very versatile, especially when you have kids. All right, so I'm going to take a sharp knife and I'm just going to cut it now in half because we're going to get ready to get our pans in order. So as even pieces as you can. Now I'm going to separate into two. So I'm going to take one, and you can form it however you want. I'm going to make more of like a loaf for the first one, like kind of how you would do, see like a loaf of Italian bread. But again, you can make it in whatever shape you desire. And you want to just kind of make it even, elongate, and then tuck in the ends. Make sure that it's all tucked. And then we're going to transfer this to our freeform sheet. And then for the second, do something similar, but it's going to just form to the loaf pan. So this second one will take the shape of the actual pan that we put it in. If you want to tuck in again, the bottom. And you have to put it in the loaf. See how it fits nicely in the parchment paper? It's okay if it leans over, it's going to rise, so you want to make sure it covers the sides. And then what you can do at this point is if you want to score the bread in any way, shape, or form, you can. So I'm just going to do some 3 slices there so that when it bakes, it's going to actually bake with those shapes in it. And then I'm just going to do one down the middle of this one in the pan. And then I like to take a little bit of olive oil and rub it in my hands and then just pat the top. That's going to help, the olive oil is going to help make that crust. So as it bakes, we'll get that nice golden, crispy crust, and then the bread inside will be nice and soft, which is what we want for our loaves. Same thing with this one. All right, so now I'm just going to set these aside, and I'm going to take our clean towel that we used before, and I'm just going to cover them, and we're going to go over to the oven and preheat. So this last rise after we prep the loaves is very short. It's just 10 minutes or so while the oven gets up to temp. And what I'm going to do is I'm just doing a regular bake. As you know, if you have a convection oven or, sorry, convection, is it convection, Mr. B? So if you have a convection style oven option, make sure you just do the regular bake option. And that's just because the convection style oven, it circulates the heat in a different way than traditional baking. You definitely want to have the traditional baking method so it doesn't cook too fast. So we're just going to do bake, and we're going to preheat it to 375. So as it's preheating, again, leave the loaves there covered. They're gonna get a last little bit of rise before we put them in the oven. Once it hits 375, we're gonna pop them in the oven for about 40 minutes. If you check on it without opening the oven, if you check on it with the light and you notice that you're not getting the right desired brownness on the top, a little bit halfway through, you can turn the heat up slightly. I wouldn't go past 400 though, because then it definitely will overcook the loaves. But we will see how that goes, and we'll check back once our bread is ready. See you soon. Okay. So the dinger went off, and we are taking our loaves out of the oven now. So 2 perfect little loaves. So I actually checked on them when it was about 5 minutes up, and I decided to leave it in for another 5 minutes just to get an extra crust on there. So they came out perfect. So you want to let it cool in the pans for, I would say, about 5 minutes or so, just so it's not too hot, and then transfer them to a rack. If you leave it in the pan for too long, like especially the bread pan, then it will start gathering moisture. But as you can see, this is going to come out very easily for cooling. So it's very easy to transfer. It doesn't stick because we did all the prep work ahead of time, and it has that nice crust on the outside, and when we cut into it, you'll see that it's nice and chewy and moist on the inside.